Do you want to learn how to use Terraform and Azure DevOps Pipeline to automate your deployment of Terraform resources? Then you have come to the right place. That is the topic of today's video. As I alluded to in the introduction, today we're going to be taking a look at how to start building out an Azure DevOps pipeline to handle the automatic rollout of infrastructure using Terraform. So we're going to tie those two pieces together. This is actually a topic that has been requested multiple times, so I figured I might actually get around to it now. So that is what we're going to talk about today. Before we get into that, I have two quick things. First of all, this was actually part of a separate demo that I did for the Apps on Cloud Summit presented by Turbonomic. Now that was last week, so that's over and done with. But if you wanted to check out that video and a bunch of other cool presentations that happened during the summit, you can find those, and I'll include a link down in the show notes. I think you might have to register if you want to view the content, but it's actually worthwhile. So highly recommend it. Definitely check it out. The other thing I want to mention, I don't think I've mentioned it in a little while, I wrote a Terraform certification guide with Aidan Ermey that's aimed at the Terraform certification for associate level. If you are interested in taking the Terraform certification, I've gotten a lot of feedback from people that said the guide was instrumental in helping them prepare. It's a very focused guide. It's a pretty short read. I think it's just over 100 pages, and it's available on LeanPub, so hit up the link down in the description if that is of interest to you. Now, let's get into provisioning Terraform using Azure DevOps. The last time that I worked with Azure DevOps Pipelines, they had two formats for pipelines. There was the classic way of doing it, which was basically building it in a GUI. I think there might have been a CLI for it, but it was mostly building the pipeline in a GUI. And then there was this newfangled YAML version, but that wasn't fully fleshed out yet, and it wasn't the de facto way of doing things. And I didn't love it because I'd gotten used to using Jenkins, where you can just write a Jenkins configuration, put a Jenkins file in your repository, and boom, there's the pipeline. There you go. Hooray. It didn't really have that, so that bothered me, and I didn't get too deep into it. Well, now the YAML side is totally supported, and it's the way to go. So that's the way that we're going to build out our pipeline. That's right. We're going to include the YAML for our Azure DevOps pipeline with the rest of our Terraform code, and then they can be versioned together. What a great idea. So let me lay out a few things that I want to do with this project, because I think this is really going to be a part one of a multi-part series, because there's a lot of things you can layer. My goal for this first video is to just get a basic pipeline running, and I want to create that pipeline using Terraform. And when I say the pipeline, I want to create the project and all of the resources that the pipeline is going to need to work with Terraform and provision resources. So that's my goal, is to create all those items via Terraform. Now, where does that Terraform configuration live and get run from? Well, it gets run from Terraform Cloud, because it's a chicken and the egg kind of thing, right? But once I have all that created, then I will have a separate set of Terraform code that's actually provisioning infrastructure, and it's doing it through this Azure pipeline that's defined in YAML. That's the basic construct. Now, initially, I'm not going to put too many bells and whistles on it. I'm going to store all of the configuration information using variables that are in the pipeline. So as the Terraform configuration runs, it can pluck out the information it needs from those variables. Some of those will be presented as environment variables, because they have to be if they're a secret type variable as opposed to a regular variable. And the other ones can be pushed through directly through the command line, not as environment variables. So if you see environment variables being used in the pipeline, it's because the variable is set to secret, so it can't be used in any other way. Aside from that, I think that's probably a good place to get started. So first, let's talk a little bit about the structure behind Azure DevOps Pipelines and what I need to create to at least get myself off the ground. Azure DevOps starts with the project as sort of the unit of management, and you can have one or more services enabled inside that project. There's things like Azure repos, which you could use instead of GitHub. There's Azure Pipeline, which is what we're going to use. And then there's a bunch of other features as well. I'm not going to get into that. If you're interested, go do the reading. The feature we actually want to use is Azure Pipelines. So the first thing I need to do is create a project with Azure Pipelines running. Okay, that's a good start. Now, what am I going to need for my Terraform configuration? Well, I'm going to need to generate a bunch of variables that will be used by my Terraform configuration. Now, I want to use some sort of remote backend for my configuration. That's kind of a requirement when it comes to a pipeline. And since I'm deploying using Azure pipelines and I'm deploying Azure stuff, I might as well use an Azure storage account. So I'm going to need to create a storage account and then feed storage account information back to the pipeline to use when it's running its Terraform init process for the backend. So I'm going to need to create variables for that. Okay. I'm also going to need to give it permissions to create resources within Azure. And the way that I can do that is by just, giving it a service principal to run as. Now, there is a way that you can integrate Azure pipelines with a service principal that's automatically generated and used by the task runner. I'm not going to use that yet. That'll be a later improvement. In the same way that a later improvement is taking Key Vault and storing all of my sensitive stuff in Key Vault and then pushing that into the pipeline as well, so I don't have to have it as variables. We'll get to that later, but that's not going to be this video. I'm just trying to get the basics started here. So I need some variables for setting up the backend, and I need some variables for my provider, for my Azure RM provider, where I'll be using it to create resources. And then I need some variables for the actual resources that are being created. So it's like 3 different sets of variables, basically. So I need to set all of that up. And then once I have all that defined, I can actually set up the pipeline itself, which involves pointing Azure pipelines at the YAML file in the repository that has the pipeline I actually want to build. So those are all the things that I have to set up ahead of time before I can actually run the pipeline. And of course, I'm going to do it with Terraform. So let's go over to Visual Studio Code and take a look at what I've created so far to set up my Azure DevOps pipeline. All right, here we are in Visual Studio Code, and the folder we're working in today is 2021-05-11 ADO. This was supposed to be created last week, but I got a little bit overwhelmed with other projects, especially that Apps On talk that was supposed to be live on live on Wednesday, and ended up having to record it on Monday. It was a rush. Anyway, so don't worry about that. There's 2 folders in here. One's called Setup and the other one's called VNet. The setup is to set up all the prerequisites we need for the Azure pipeline, and then the VNet is there. That's the actual configuration we want to deploy using the pipeline. There's a README in here as well that can kind of walk you through what my ideas are and what I've got working so far. Now, if you're looking for these files, you can always find them. They're on my GitHub account under the repository that's up on the screen right now. So just go there if you're looking for these files and you wanted to follow along. Let's take a look at what I had to provision under ADO. Well, there's actually a few things you have to do before you do that. And there's some prerequisites that you're going to need. So first, let's go into setup here and see what's in the setup that was required for me to create. Now I have a bunch of different files in here. Let's start with the terraform.tf. What providers did I have to use? I've collected all the providers here. I'm using the Microsoft Azure DevOps provider, which is admittedly at a 0.1 phase, so not everything is fully supported in there. I have the Azure RM provider in here, which I am not really, I guess I am using that. And then for GitHub, I thought I was going to have to create some GitHub stuff. I think I ended up not having to use that, but it's still in there. And then finally, I'm using Terraform Cloud as my backend, so I can keep the state off of my computer, which has been my goal lately, is no more local state whenever possible. All right, so that's what I've got in my Terraform configuration. Moving over to variables, I've got a bunch of variables I have to define here. Let me just walk through a few of them. The ADO org service URL, this is the URL of your Azure DevOps account. You can just go to and sign into Azure DevOps and get that URL. It's pretty straightforward. The ADO GitHub repo, this is the repository that you want to link to the pipeline. Mine is called Ned1313 Terraform Tuesdays. Obviously, if you're following along, just change it to whatever your GitHub org and repo name is. If you fork it, it's going to be something very similar to this. And then I have another one, which is the YAML path. And this is a path from the root of the repository to where the YAML file is. If you fork the repository, this should just work. The GitHub personal authentication token. You're going to have to go on GitHub and go under your account settings into the developer area and generate a personal access token that has access to read repositories. If you don't do that, this ain't going to work. The next thing is a prefix for naming things. No big deal. Then we get into our Azure specific variables. We need an Azure location. We need a container name in the storage account that we're going to create. We need a key that we're going to use to store the remote state. And then we also need a few more things these are the values it's going to use to provision infrastructure using the pipeline. So the client ID and client secret, the subscription, and the tenant name. And then finally, I'm creating a random integer to use for naming things. And then I have a bunch of locals that create the various names I want to use. So that's everything that's in the variables area. Now, how are we using those variables? Let's get into the Azure DevOps configuration and take a look at that. All right, in Azure DevOps, for the provider, you have to give it the org service URL to connect to on the provider. You also need to give it some sort of authentication. Now, it's a little confusing here because in the documentation, it seems like you have to have a separate authentication nested block in here and then have the personal access token aside from that. Don't do that. Just leave it like this and create the personal access token. And you're going to use that by using this environment variable that I have configured in Terraform Cloud. Scrolling down a little bit more, I ended up not using the GitHub provider, though I did think I needed it for a while. Maybe I did end up needing it. Let's see what happens in the rest of the configuration. Like I said, last week was a little crazy. First, we have to create a project in Azure DevOps. So we're going to use the Azure DevOps project resource, and the only feature we're going to enable is pipelines. Everything else is in a disabled status. Scrolling down a bit more, we're going to create a service endpoint for GitHub. This is how we connect to GitHub to pull that repository information that has our Terraform configuration as well as the build pipeline YAML file. And this is where we actually need the GitHub personal access token. And that goes in the auth personal area. It did say that you could use an environment variable for this. I never got it to work right. It errored out every time. So you're going to have to store the personal access token in a variable. I don't love it, but that's the way that it works today. Remember, this is a relatively early provider, so we're doing what we can with it. Scrolling down a little bit more, we have an Azure DevOps resource authorization block where we give it the project ID. We give it the resource ID. This is the service endpoint, and say authorize true. This authorizes all the pipelines in your project to use that GitHub service connection. Otherwise, they're not allowed to use it. So very important to put that in there, or you'll be like, why isn't this working? And then lastly, we're going to create a variable group. These are all the variables that we're going to use within our pipeline configuration, and I have them all listed out here. Storage account, container name, key. Then you notice that the SAS token is set to secret. The SAS token is going to be generated by the information in the Azure storage.tf file. That creates the storage account and then also creates a SAS token that you can use to access that storage account. That information is going to be stored as a variable that can be used by the build pipeline. So that's why that's in there. The next few variables are setting up the credentials that it can use to create resources in Azure. So the client ID, client secret, subscription, and tenant, we're passing those straight through to create as variables within the pipeline. Within the project, which will be accessed by the pipeline. And then the last thing is a build definition. This is what actually creates the pipeline. And in order to do that, we are going to set the depend on that authorization, because we can't connect to GitHub until that authorization resource completes, but there's no real direct connection between the two different resources. So this is a way of getting around it, adding the depends on in here. Down in repository, we tell it what repository we're going to use, the name of the branch we want to use, and the path to the YAML file. Remember, that was all in variables. And then we have our service connection ID. That should be everything. That's going to create all the stuff we need in Azure DevOps. And in the Azure storage, we don't have to go through this whole thing. Like I said, this basically creates a storage account, a storage container, and then creates a SaaS token to be used by the build pipeline when it's initializing the backend and updating the backend. Okay, so that's everything that's in my setup configuration. I've already run it, but let's go over to the Terraform cloud and I'll show you the variables I had to create over there. Okay, here we are in Terraform Cloud, and these are the variables I had to create for the workspace in Terraform Cloud that I'm using to deploy the setup infrastructure for Azure DevOps. I've got 2 Terraform variables here. I've got the org service URL and the ADO GitHub pat, and I've set that to sensitive because that is some sensitive information. It's personal access token or authorization token. And then we have all the environment variables I'm creating. So the AZDO personal access token, you have to go into Azure DevOps and create a personal access token there that can be used for programmatic access to Azure DevOps. So you're going to have to create that. And then the AZDO GitHub service connection pat, I actually am not using that anymore. So I have to remove that. I tried using that environment variable, and every time it failed because of the way that the provider's configured right now. Instead, you have to use a variable for it instead. So it's unfortunate, but it's kind of the way it is right now. Other environment variables that are set, I'm using tf_var to set the environment variables for variable settings. It's a little confusing. Rather than actually supplying the variable at runtime, you can do it through tf_var. So that's what I'm doing. It'll work either way. And then lastly, I'm adding all of the Azure variables that are necessary for creating resources within Microsoft Azure, which will create the storage account. So that is everything that's in the environment variables. You can take a snapshot of it. I'm also going to add this into the README. So, you don't have to write all this down. It will be in the README eventually. So that's everything that's going on in my Terraform Cloud provisioning for the setup portion of the pipeline. Now, I also have the projects open here. So let's go and look at my project. So this is the project that was created by running that setup script. And you can see the only thing that's available is pipelines. So we can go into pipelines, and there's the pipeline that was created dynamically. If we go under library, that's where we can see the variables that have been created. And here's my Terraform Tuesdays variable group. If we go in there, we can see all the different variables that were created by the Terraform configuration. And we can see that allow access to all pipelines is toggled. So all the pipelines are able to use this variable group, including the pipeline that I created. And then if we go under pipelines, this is the pipeline that was automatically created. And if I click on that, it will show me the most recent run of this pipeline. Okay, so that's everything that got created in Azure DevOps. Now, you probably want to know what's in the pipeline. So let's go back to Visual Studio and we'll take a look at what's actually in the pipeline.yaml file. What are we actually doing to deploy this whole thing? All right, we're back in Visual Studio Code, and now let's expand the vnet directory. And we've got 2 files in here. We've got the main.tf, and this is what's actually getting provisioned in Azure by this whole pipeline. It's real simple. If we scroll down, really all it's doing is creating a resource group, and then it's creating an Azure virtual network in that resource group with 2 subnets. That's it. That's all the infrastructure we're creating. I tried to keep it simple because I don't really care that much about what I'm provisioning at this point. I just need the process to work. That process is encoded in Azure pipelines.yaml. So let's take a look at that file instead. All right, so this is the YAML file, and the structure of the YAML file is pretty well documented by Microsoft, so I'm not going to go deep into it. The first thing I got to do is, because I'm using a variable group that is outside of this pipeline directly, it's available to all pipelines, I have to say, what's the name of the group of variables that I want to add into this pipeline? And it's called Terraform Tuesday. Cool. The next thing is the trigger. What determines whether or not this pipeline runs? What I've told it in here is if there is a change to main, that should trigger it, but only if the change is on a specific path. And that specific path is this directory, the vnet directory. So if a change happens on that path, trigger the pipeline. Any other changes? Don't trigger the pipeline because I don't want to change to a new module of Terraform Tuesday to cause a cascade of triggers on other pipelines, right? I just want it scoped to this particular directory. Then we get into stages. So if you've ever used Jenkins, this should seem very familiar to you. You've got one or more stages in your pipeline. The first stage I'm calling validate. And the idea here is I just want to validate that the code is good before I move on to the next stage. So the validation stage is made up of jobs. And in this case, we only have one job. And then the job is made up of steps. And then the steps have tasks. So you can see there's a whole hierarchy going on here, right? All right. So under job, I tell it which VM image I want to use to run this job. And I'm using the latest Ubuntu. And then the first task of this job is to install Terraform. And in this case, I'm installing the latest version of Terraform because that's fine for me. In your case, if you were doing this in production, you would probably want to specify which Terraform version you want to use for now so you don't get burned by a new release that breaks something for you. Then we're going to initialize Terraform. This is a brand new instance. It doesn't know anything about the backend or the providers, so we have to initialize Terraform. You can see in here, I'm passing an environment variable, which is the SaaS token. And I have to do it through an environment variable because the SaaS token is secret, and that's the only way to pass that value from a variable. The working directory specifies which directory I'm working in, which is the VNet directory. That's the context where it's going to run this command. And then the actual command is init. And I'm adding some command options here to configure the backend because I just have a partial config sitting in the actual main.tf. So I'm configuring the storage account, the container name, and the key, and it's going to use that ARM SaaS token environment variable for authentication. Then we can finally validate the config now that it's been initialized. So I'm going to run the command validate. If that returns false, this pipeline stops because something's invalid about the configuration. It's not worth moving forward. If it is successful, we move into the next stage, which is plan. And under plan, I have to go through some of the same steps again. Once again, I have to install Terraform because this is a new job, which is going to be on a new VM image. Okay. And I'm going to run an initialization. No problem. We already saw what that does. Then I'm going to run a plan. Now for plan, I need to specify some additional information for the config. I need all of the authentication information for my Azure RM provider, and I'm passing all of that through environment variables because that's the easiest way to do it. So I have all my environment variables here. The command is plan, and I set the working directory. It's going to run a plan, and then it's going to move to a new stage, which is called approve. And this stage is there to wait for manual validation of what's happened so far and tell it whether or not to move forward. If 60 minutes goes by and it's sitting in the approval state, it's going to cancel out the task. Otherwise, I have to go in and review the plan, see what is in the plan of what's in the logs of the previous stage where it planned out the deployment. And if it looks good to me, I can give it the thumbs up and tell it to move to the final stage. That final stage is apply. Pretty straightforward. So it's going to apply the same configuration that was in plan. All right, so we are once again installing Terraform. We're initializing Terraform. And then we're running apply with the same environment variables we used for plan. It's just the command is apply, and I'm adding the command option auto approve. Now you might note that this is not grabbing a plan file from anywhere. And that is not great in my opinion. I'd rather run the plan, stash the plan file somewhere, and then pull that plan file and use that to run the apply so I know that I'm getting the same results I expect. If my plan file is out of date and someone else has applied a change, even though they shouldn't have, I want the process to halt there. So that's everything that's in my pipeline today. If I made a change to the main.tf file, if I go in here and, I don't know, let's add another subnet, right? We'll do 10.0.3.0/24, and we'll add another subnet name in here. We'll call it subnet 3. Okay, so if I save this file, that means I've got a new commit, And so we'll say subnet 3 and commit that, and then go ahead and push it up to the repository. That should kick off a build process in the Azure DevOps pipeline. So let's switch back to there and see what's happening. All right, we're back in Azure DevOps, and you can see that based off of my commit, which was subnet 3, that was my message in there, it's kicked off a new instance of that pipeline, and it's in the first stage. We can go ahead and click on this and get a better view of what the stages are. It's in validate right now. So let's go ahead and click on that, and it'll show us what's going on in my validate. Now, it just moved from validate to plan, which, oh no, it hasn't. It's still in Initialize Terraform. Okay, let's wait. All right, it's validating the config, and now it jumped to post job. So we can just click on validate config, and we can see success. The configuration is valid. So it got that far. Everything's good. Now it's going to move to the plan phase of things. So now it's in the plan, and it's waiting for an agent from the cloud. Now I've seen this take a few minutes, so I'm going to let things fast forward a little bit so it gets to the part where the plan is finished and we're ready to review it and approve it. All right, now we're in the approve stage. And what I should do is go back and look at the plan stage and see what it ended up telling me it's going to do. If I scroll down, it tells me, hey, I'm going to add a subnet, which is exactly what I expected to do. That looks like a good change to me. So I can go to wait for approval, click on the review button and say subnet 3, good, and click on resume. That will move it past the approval stage, and now we'll go into the apply stage where it's actually going to create that third subnet by running the same Terraform configuration with the auto approve flag for apply. Now that might take a moment, so I'll go ahead and fast forward things to the end where the apply should complete successfully. Okay, my apply has completed successfully. If we click on the apply log here, we can see apply complete, resources added 1. Awesome, our subnet was added. It looks like our pipeline run was 100% successful, all green check marks. Now I want to say, the first few times I ran this with a different project and pipeline, there was a lot of red. So don't feel bad if you're trying to set one of these up and you see a lot of red. That is to be expected. All right, so we have gone through the process of setting up Azure DevOps Pipelines using Terraform. So we use Terraform to create the whole thing, and then we're using the pipeline to deploy resources using Terraform. Now, this is a relatively simple pipeline right now. It's just checking the code is valid. It's creating a plan, telling you to review it, and then applying. That's it. Now, there was a lot of work that went into setting all this up. I'm sure you felt that as we went through all the details. The good news is once you have it codified, you only have to do it once, and then it's just a simple matter of updating the code and letting the pipeline take over. There's also a lot of additional things we can add into this pipeline. I mentioned one of them. It's not putting the plan file anywhere. I'm not even creating a plan file. I don't like that. I would like it to create a plan file and stash it, maybe in that storage account that I created for the back end. So that's a task I want to add to the pipeline. It's also not using Azure Key Vault to store all of these very important variables. I'd rather use Key Vault for that. So I'm going to add Key Vault into the mix. It's also not doing any sort of scanning of the code for potential security violations. There's a great tool called Checkoff by Bridgecrew. I would like to add Checkoff into the pipeline to validate that it's not breaking any security rules. And also right now, this is simply committing to main, which I also don't want to do. I would rather have a workflow where I push up a new version and make a pull request from a new branch to the main branch and have it kick off one workflow to accept that pull request, or at least review that pull request, make sure that the code is formatted properly and that it is a valid Terraform config, and then have a separate pipeline that goes through the actual plan and apply once that code is merged into main. So it should actually be two separate pipelines. You see where I'm going here? So I'm starting it out as simple as possible. And now I'm going to slowly add additional pieces to that pipeline. And we're going to do that in future episodes. But that is going to do it for me today. That's enough. Hopefully your brain is not overflowing at this point. It's all good. If you've been enjoying the stuff that I have been putting up on here and you want a way to support me, hey, I have a Patreon and I would love some support. If you do sign up, you get early access to these videos and a weekly newsletter. So that's kind of nice. And it starts at $2 a month. So that's like 50 cents an episode or something. It's not bad, right? If that's not your thing, I totally get it. If you want to subscribe to the channel, that is obviously much appreciated. If you want to spread the good word on Twitter or LinkedIn, also appreciate it. And if you have comments, I do read them. So feel free to leave a comment if there's a topic you want me to cover or anything along those lines. As always, thank you so much for watching. Until next time, stay healthy, stay safe out there. Bye for now. See this mug? This is a Carly Rae Jepsen mug. Not that you could tell, because the first time we put it in the dishwasher, almost all the paint came off, and now there's just like little flecks of rainbow paint on here, but that's it. That's all it's got. It was very sad. It was a sad day when I took it out of the dishwasher, but I don't care because I love me some Carly, and I'm going to keep using this coffee mug as long as it will let me. Bye.